Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Jaya Radha Gopinath Radha Gopinath Shri Radhe. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Jai Om Shripad Paramahamsa Parivrajakacarya Ashtattarashata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Abhayachanaravindra Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Jai Om Vishnupad Paramahamsa Parivrajakacarya Ashtattarashata Shri Srimad Divine Grace Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Thakur Maharaj Prabhupada Ki Jai. Ananta Koti Vaishnava Vrinda Ki Jai. Samaveta Gaura Bhakta Vrinda Ki Jai. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam Ki Jai. Janitai Gaur Premanande. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Okay, today we're reading from Canto 3, Chapter 6, Creation of the Universal Form, text number 3. Sonu pravishto bhagavansh. Sonu pravishto bhagavansh. Cheshta rupena tam ganam. Cheshta rupena tam ganam. Binnam samyojya yamasa. Binnam samyojya yamasa. Suptam karma prabhodayan. Suptam karma prabhodayan. Sonu pravishto bhagavansh. Cheshta rupena tam ganam. Binnam samyojya yamasa. Suptam karma prabhodayan. Sonu pravishto bhagavansh. Cheshta rupena tam ganam. Binnam samyojya yamasa. Suptam karma prabhodayan.
Vinam samyojaya nasa Suddham karma prabodhaya Srishta rupena tamgana Vinam samyojaya nasa Suddham karma prabodhaya Sonupravishta bhagavan Srishta rupena tamgana Vinam samyojaya nasa Suddham karma prabodhaya
Saha, that, anupravishtaha, thus entering later on, Bhagavan, the personality of Godhead, Cheshta Rupena, by his representation of attempt, Kali, Tam, them, Ganam, all the living entities, including the demigods, Bhinnam, separately, Samyojayam asa, engaged to work, Suptam, sleeping, Karma, work, Prabodhayan, enlightening. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai. Translation: Thus, when the personality of Godhead entered into the elements by his energy, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. Purport: every individual soul remains unconscious after the dissolution of the creation and thus enters into the Lord with his material energy. These individual living entities are conditioned souls everlastingly, but in each and every material creation, they are given a chance to liberate themselves and become free souls. They are all given a chance to take advantage of the Vedic wisdom and find out what is their relationship with the Supreme Lord, how they can be liberated, and what the ultimate profit is in such liberation. By properly studying the Vedas, one becomes conscious of his position and thus takes to the transcendental devotional service of the Lord and is gradually promoted to the spiritual sky. The individual souls in the material world engage in different activities according to their past unfinished desires. After the dissolution of a particular body, the individual soul forgets everything. But the all-merciful Lord, who is situated in everyone's heart as the witness, the Supersoul, awakens him and reminds him of his past desires, and thus he begins to act accordingly in his next life. This unseen guidance is described as fate, and a sensible man can understand that this continues in his material bondage in the three modes of nature. The unconscious sleeping stage of the living entity just after the partial or total dissolution of the creation is wrongly accepted as the final stage of life by some less intelligent philosophers. After the dissolution of the partial material body, a living entity remains unconscious for only a few months. And after the total dissolution of the material creation, he remains unconscious for millions of years. But when the creation is again revived, he is awakened to his work by the Lord. The living entity is eternal, and the wakeful state of his consciousness, manifested by activities, is his natural condition of life. He cannot stop acting while awake, and thus he acts according to his diverse desires. When his desires are trained in the transcendental service of the Lord, his life becomes perfect, and he is promoted to the spiritual sky to enjoy eternal awakened life. Om Ajnanatimirandasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobishtam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Swayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Swapadantikam Vandeham Shri Guru Shri Utapadakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatam Sahagana Raghunathanvitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savdutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri Vishakhanvitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dina Bandho Jagatpate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostute Tapte Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Vanchakalpaturubhyasya Kripa Sindhu Bhyevacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasari Gaura Bhaktarinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare 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 Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. Okay, welcome everyone to Sunday morning Srimad Bhagavatam class. So we started a new chapter yesterday, creation of the universal form, and this chapter is going to describe to us about the results of the prayers of the demigod, as we know in the previous chapter, because the first several verses in the start of this current chapter, chapter 6, they're actually summarizing the previous chapter. We saw in the previous chapter that we were talking about the Srimad Bhagavatam was discussing about the sarga creation, right? Not the visarga. The sarga. Sarga means the creation in which the raw material ingredients are provided to Lord Brahma by Vishnu. And then Brahma utilizes these to create all the forms within material nature. That's called visarga. So sarga, visarga. So here, and then we saw how Mahavishnu is glancing upon the pradhan, which then diversifies upon being activated by different energies, such as the time energy. Yesterday's verse we were reading, Kamsari Prabhu was reading that another energy is Kali herself, Durga Devi herself. So she also actually enters within Lord Vishnu's, Mahavishnu's glance. And then you have three modes of material nature from which comes ignorance, passion, goodness. From them come the ahankar, false ego, etc. So that continues. So in today's verse, Srimad Bhagavatam is talking about, again it's talking about how the personality of Godhead, Lord Mahavishnu, he glanced, and through his glance, in his glance contained all the living entities. And they got transferred from his body, because as you know, when the complete dissolution of the entire material manifestation occurs, right, all the universes are sucked up into the body of Mahavishnu, right? So then he impregnates the Mahatattva again with all the countless living entities, all the jivas, through his glance. Angani yasya sakalendriya vrittimanti pashyanti panti kalayanti chiram jaganti. This verse from Brahma Samhita perfectly captures this sarga creation. Angani yasya sakalendriya vrittimanti. If we want to have children, then we have to reproduce, we have to use a certain organ, our genitals, to reproduce. But the senses of Vishnu are absolute. He can impregnate just by his glance, and his glance contains the living entities. So he glances into material nature and he impregnates in that way. Pashyanti, how? Pashyanti panti, kalayanti chiram jaganti. By looking, he glances upon material nature. And by doing that, it says here, all the living entities were enlivened into different activities, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. So later on in this chapter, we're going to come across a series of verses in which the demigods, upon being instructed and enlivened as to their service, then they actually assume different positions within the Virat Purusha. And the Virat Purusha, which is being described, because generally, like elsewhere in Srimad Bhagavatam, I think it was in Canto 2, when Srimad Bhagavatam is talking about Virat Purusha, we learn that Virat Purusha is a temporary material manifestation, or rather a representation of Krishna. Right? He's made up completely of the material elements. And the pantheists, which Srila Prabhupada discusses in Canto 2, they see this Virat Purusha as we know, we've discussed many times, they see the things in material nature as forms of his body, like the sun and the moon or his eyes, etc. The rivers are his veins and his arteries. But in this particular context, the Virat Purusha is actually talking about the universal Purusha, the Purusha within each universe, who is Garbhodakashayi Vishnu. And he's described as being Hiranyamaya. From Hiranyamaya, Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, comes the lotus from which Lord Brahma is born, and then the Visarga creation continues. From the Visarga creation. So that is the Virat Rupa. So this universe is created, and then he creates the demigods, but they're sort of in an inert state. They don't know how to go about carrying their duty. So this Virat Purusha, it's explained in the later verses of this chapter, that he assumed the capacity to hear. And then the demigods responsible for hearing actually assumed their position upon that part of the Virat Purusha's body. And then the faculty of hearing came, the object of the senses came, etc. Or, for example, taste. So the body of Virat Purusha manifested the capacity to taste, because everything starts from Krishna. Life comes from life. Right? Krishna or Vishnu is the source of life for this entire universe. He's the super soul for the entire universe. Just as our soul is the source of life for our present material body that we're in. So this universal body is actually the life which is giving consciousness to this universe, is Garbhodakashayi Vishnu, the Virat Purusha. So he developed the capacity to taste. The demigods responsible for taste assume their position on the tongue of the Virat Purusha, and therefore now the living entities can taste. Because Virat Purusha can do it, so then everyone else can do it. So this is how it's explained. There's a nice story in 10th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, towards the end, about Bahulashva and Shrutadeva. I think these are two pure devotees that Krishna had in a city called Mithila. So one day Lord Krishna decided to visit Mithila, and he took with him a lot of sages, like all the famous universal sages were there with him. And he took all of the sages with him on the chariot, and they went, Daruka was there, they left Dwarka, and they arrived at Mithila. And Bahulashva was the king. He was a Kshatriya. And Shrutadeva, he was a simple Brahmana. So, being pure devotees of Krishna, they used to worship the deity of Krishna with great faith and reverence every day. So Krishna in Dwarka decided to reciprocate with them. So he decided to visit them personally. Even though the point should be made that the deity is also non-different from Krishna himself. So Krishna first of all, he went to the house of Bahulashva, and there it's explained nicely how Bahulashva, he received Krishna according to his position, befitting his position as a king. And then after that, he went to the house of Shrutadeva. And Shrutadeva, he was so excited that he actually jumped up and down and he started waving his chadar, his shawl around actually, it's explained. But there in that conversation between Shrutadeva and Krishna, Krishna mentions something very interesting. He says that just as the Brahmanas contain within them all the Vedas, within the body of Krishna or Vishnu, all the demigods are there. So Krishna, in the purport, has explained that Krishna depends on the Brahmanas to disseminate the knowledge of the Vedas in society. So similarly, just as the bodies of the Brahmanas contain the knowledge of the Vedas, the Brahmanas are the embodiments of the Vedas. Similarly, Krishna is the embodiment of the demigods. And here we're seeing that in this part of the Srimad Bhagavatam, we're seeing that about how Krishna's body, on Krishna's transcendental body are situated in different positions, all the different demigods. So that's the context for this present chapter of Srimad Bhagavatam. And Srila Prabhupada starts off the purport by talking about how the individual living entities are conditioned souls everlastingly. Nityabada. We see in Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Mudha Janmani Janmani. Right? Those souls who are affected by lust and they have that desire to enjoy separately from Krishna, Krishna says that he casts them into lower species of life after life. But does this mean that Krishna is ungrateful, that he is not merciful? Some religious philosophies we learn, they say that in this lifetime you have to choose. Either you become a devotee of God, you become pious, or you continue sinful life, and the result is either you get eternal fulfillment of all your desires and enjoyment for yourself in heaven, or if you're sinful, then you go to hell. Eternally you go to hell. Now even parents in this world, if their child does something wrong, they'll only punish them for a certain amount of time. Right? No one punishes someone. Even the government doesn't punish a criminal, unless they've done something like terribly wrong. There's always a sentence that prisoners are given. 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 25 years. Within that period of time, you're supposed to learn and rectify a mentality, the bad mentality that you've developed. That's Bhaktividya Purnamaya said once he was giving a class, and he said that the purpose of punishment is to rectify a bad or negative mentality. Once the mentality has been rectified, the punishment serves absolutely no purpose. That's it. So Krishna is completely merciful. And we see that in many parts throughout the Shastra. Like one that comes to mind is in Bhagavad Gita, in the 12th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Krishna says that he would like us to dedicate our mind, manana bhakti, and smarana bhakti. Manana bhakti means applying your mind to Krishna. Smarana bhakti means applying your intelligence to Krishna, in Krishna's service. Mayeva mana adatsva, may buddhim. Mayeva mana, mayeva buddhim. Nivasishyasi mayeva athordhamna samshaya, Krishna says to Arjuna. This is the topmost form of bhakti. Mind means, if your mind is wandering here and there, then, as is explained in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, bring your mind away from the objects of the senses. This is called pratyahar. So pratyahar is applied in bhakti as well. Pratyahar actually is a stage in Dhyan Yoga, but is to be applied in bhakti as well. Kurma anganiva is explained in the 2nd chapter of Bhagavad Gita. Just as a tortoise withdraws its limbs when there is danger, so similarly the yogi, the sthita prajna, he also withdraws his senses from the allurements of the material energy. So he withdraws these. So mana and buddhi. This is the first one. And Krishna says, if you can't do that, okay, he says, atta chittam samadatum na shaknoshi maisiram abhyasa yogena tato mam ipchaptum dhananjaya. He says, immediately the next verse after that, is he says, okay, fine. If you can't give your chitta to me, if you can't give your consciousness to me, then at least abhyasa yogena tato. At least start practicing the regulative principles of bhakti. Start following the 4 regulative principles, start chanting Hare Krishna, start worshipping the deity, start worshipping Tulsi Mari. Do the transcendentally pious activities within the system of yoga, bhakti yoga, buddhi yoga. Okay? This is called, like we're having a nectar devotion class as well, we're discussing about rag bhakti, raganuga bhakti and vaidhi bhakti. So this abhyasa yogena tato, Krishna is saying, he's talking about vidhi bhakti, he's talking about vaidhi bhakti. Rules and regulations. You do it because Someone is forcing you to do it for your own benefit. The Guru is forcing us to practice, to engage in bhakti by following the regulated principles. Krishna says, even if you can't do that, abhyasya api samartosi, mat karma paramo bhava, madaratam api karmani kurvan siddhim avapsisi. Krishna is telling Arjuna, if you can't even engage in the regulative practice of bhakti, which we are all attempting to do, then he says, at least work for me. At least work for me. And if you work for me, then, giving up the results of your activities, then you will attain perfection. Siddhi, he says. And Srila Prabhupada in the purport there in the 12th chapter, he gives the example of people who may not have enough faith to come and associate with the devotees, with the Lord's devotees, and develop intimate relationships with them. Or they may not even have so much faith in the deity. Sometimes we see people, they come and they take darshan. They don't even take darshan sometimes. They come, they just put some donation on the altar and they just look just for 1 or 2 seconds and you'll see them walking out. That's it. And I admit, when I was younger, when I had no knowledge, because I had not read Srila Prabhupada's books, when my parents used to take me to the temple, very occasionally I used to go. I used to like going so much because I didn't know what's the whole point, what's the whole purpose of going to the temple. And they used to come, and they used to take me to the temple, and I just remember they used to get some pujari to come and just offer some fruits, and they'll just ask, what is your gotra? And then they'll do some puja, and then that's it. That was the temple. And then before you come out, you just take some food there. That was the visit to the temple. So I was thinking, what's the point in doing that? So he says, at least work for me. He says, Srila Prabhupada saying in the purport, he's saying that for such people who don't have that level of faith, at least they should give or sacrifice that which they've worked so hard for in the service of Krishna. So they can, Srila Prabhupada says specifically, he says, at least they should donate for a transcendental cause. They should donate, they should give something for the Krishna consciousness movement, and by doing that, so this is sort of like karma yoga. It's karma yoga. So you're not directly engaging so much in bhakti, but you're acting in the material world how you want to act, but you're giving the results to Krishna. Krishna says, even if you can't do that, Athaitad api ashaktosi kartum adyogam ashita sarva karma phalatyagas tyagat chantir anantaram. He says, if you want peace, he says to Arjuna, if you want peace, and if you can't do any of the other 3 processes which I've outlined, he says, at least develop detachment, develop vairagya. You don't have to offer things to me. You don't have to give donations for some spiritual cause or anything like that. You don't even have to come to the temple. But do activities in this material world which will cultivate detachment. So work for others' benefit. Sanyamyendriya gramam sarvatra samabuddhaya te prapnuvanti mameva sarvabhuta hiterata. He tells to Arjuna that those who are worshipping the impersonal, for them the path is very difficult. Kleshodikataras tesham avyakta saktase chetasam. Avyaktai gatir dukkham dehevad biravapsi. Krishna says, a very difficult path. But still those people, by working sarvabhuta hiterata, by working for others, right? We learn, Srila Prabhupada often says in his purports, that the impersonalists who go to the Brahma Jyoti, again they come back down. They don't want to go back again to the Brahma Jyoti because they know it's not a place of no return. Again, they'll have to come back down to this material world. So then they do bhuta hiterata activities like opening hospitals and feeding the poor. So Krishna is saying, by doing that, gradually, lifetime after lifetime, you'll develop detachment of this material world. You will no longer act for yourself, for your own sense gratification. The only difference then is transcendental knowledge. If a devotee comes along and gives a person in the mature world who's already detached from sense gratification transcendental knowledge, then it's a very easy step from that platform, from the mode of goodness, to then, instead of working for others' benefit, to work directly for Krishna. And by working for Krishna, then that is, everyone else is included in that. We learned that from Srimad Bhagavatam as well. Yatataror mula nishchinena, I think that's the verse. So, Krishna's mercy is demonstrated in that way. So Krishna, at the same time, he teaches a lesson to the conditioned souls by keeping them everlastingly But at the same time, he always throws a lifeline. So that's one thing that comes to mind. The second thing Srila Prabhupada is saying is that after the dissolution of a particular body, the individual soul forgets everything. But the all-merciful Lord, who is situated in all of our hearts, reminds the soul of the past desires. And then he begins to act in his present lifetime. And Srila Prabhupada is saying, this is what is known as fate. So what we call fate, fate means whatever happens to us. Pious reactions, impious reactions. If we don't believe in the arrangement of Krishna, in the arrangement of the Supreme Personality Godhead, or Srila Prabhupada is saying in the Super Soul, then we call that whatever comes to us as fate. Or it just happened to come. Just like the famous example in Bhagavatam is Parikshit Maharaj, right? Was it by fate that he put the snake around Shamika Rishi? Some would say that it is fate, but actually the real reason is because the Super Soul inspired him to do that. Because, as is mentioned in the purports, that a pure devotee would, never do such a thing to offend a great Brahmana, to offend a great Rishi. The Kshatriyas respect the Brahmanas so much, and he was in the ashram, he knew that the Rishi was meditating. So normally a pure devotee would not do anything like that. But by the will of providence, by Krishna's inspiration, because Srimad Bhagavatam had to be spoken, he did so. Similarly, we see another instance in Ramayana. We know Dashrath. The reason why Ramayana says, or maybe one of the reasons why Ramayana says, I don't know so much about Ramayana, but if we see the story of Dashrath, King Dashrath, right, Lord Ram's father, he left this world because of intense separation from his two sons, which were forced into exile into the forest, right? Rama and Lakshmana, specifically Lord Ram. He was a very beloved son of Dashrath. He was forced into exile by Kaikeyi, and Dashrath Maharaj, he died after some time. He passed away after some time because of intense lamentation due to separation from Lord Rama. And then Ramayana talks about a story which happened to Dashrath Maharaj before, when he was a younger prince, about how he was actually in the forest and he was hunting, as Kshatriyas do. And he thought he saw something in the distance, some animal, and he actually got his arrow and he shot the arrow. And it actually pierced a boy. And this boy, he was actually fetching water from a nearby river. And he actually went and he saw that he actually not shot an animal, but he had, potentially, this boy was dying, he was about to die. He said, I'm very sorry. I didn't know, I thought you were just some ordinary animal I couldn't see in the foliage. And he said, look, I came to this river to fetch water for my parents, my elderly parents. And both of them are blind. And they're depending on me to take care of them. And now I'm going to die, and so who will take care of them? So he's very sad, and he passes away. Dashrath Maharaj also, feels that shock and lamentation. So he actually takes it upon himself to go to these parents and break the news to them that he had accidentally killed their son. And then they utter a curse to Dashrath Maharaj, telling him that just as you have killed someone, our dear beloved son, so in the future, your son will also do the same thing to you. So and they also give up their life, actually, I think, from memory. These two parents of that boy who died, they also give up their life as well. So this was a reaction. So we can call that fate. If this happened to a materialist, if this happened to a karmi, he would just say, this is just fate. It's just something that happened to me. This is my fate. This is your fate, this is my fate. But we see that this is actually the arrangement of the Super Soul. This is the arrangement of Krishna. How can Krishna not be arranging every single thing which happens in the life of his pure devotee, his father, Dashrath Maharaj? The Super Soul is inspiring Dashrath Maharaj to do such things. Right? So that's one thing, and there's another story about fate I want to say, but that's fine. We'll get into the main part of the purport. The main part of the purport, Srila Prabhupada is talking about what, see we have this word here, it's called suptam. So suptam is translated as sleeping. So the living entities are transferred from a state of suptam to a state of waking, where they start performing the activities within this material world. So according to the Mandukya Upanishad, there's 4 different avasthas for the mind. Avastha in Sanskrit means state or condition. So Srila Prabhupada, sometimes Srila Prabhupada, you'll see in his purports, he discusses this. He doesn't go so much into detail, but the mind has 4 types of avasthas. The first one is Jagrata Avastha. Jagrata Avastha means when our consciousness is transmitted through the subtle body, through the gross body, out into the material world. So this Jagrata Avastha is what we are experiencing right now. We're aware of our surroundings, we're aware of the objects of the senses, and we're awake, and we're experiencing everything. We're not sleeping, we're awake. This is called Jagrata Avastha. Then if you go more subtle, the next avastha is called Swapna Avastha. Swapna Avastha means when the consciousness is directed through the subtle body, but it is not being directed through the gross body and out into the material world. It stops. Our consciousness is only infusing only into the subtle body. So when we sleep at nighttime, we are dreaming, right? We dream of so many different things. So this Swapna Avastha means our body is resting. Our body is not active. It's not physically active, right? Our eyes are closed. Our ears are not conscious of sounds around us. So our consciousness is not so much exuding out into the environment through our gross body. It's just on the subtle platform, and therefore our physical body is at rest and we're dreaming. This is called Swapna Avastha. Then one more after that, one more deeper, more subtle, is called Sushupti Avastha. So that's where this word is coming from, today's word. Suptam, sleeping. Sushupti Avastha means where the consciousness is just existing, but it's not being, Chaitanya Sriman Prabhu explained, it's not directing itself. It's not going along the path of trajectory through the subtle body or even into the physical gross body, out into the material world. It's just existing. And examples of the Sushupta state of the mind is when we're sleeping, sometimes we won't dream. Right? Sometimes we'll have a dreamless sleep. It's in English you could call it dreamless sleep. So this dreamless sleep is called Sushupta. So your mind is not active. That means in Swapna state, your physical body is at rest. Right? But your mind is active. In Sushupti state, what is happening is your physical body is at rest and your mind is also sleeping as well. So your subtle body is also sleeping as well. So when the subtle body is sleeping and the physical body is sleeping, that is called Sushupti Avastha. Another example is when we're in a coma, or sometimes people have been given anesthesia. They're conscious, but they may not be dreaming as well. They're not in that dreaming state. And just like, when you wake up in the morning, you may have been dreaming, you may have not been dreaming. But if you can't remember a dream, right? If you've entered that Sushupti state, stage of deep sleep where you're not dreaming, you still feel as if you existed, right? When you wake up in the morning and you can't remember your dreams, right? So you just slept at night and then you woke up and you can't remember any dreams. You have yourself having any dreams. Still, you have a feeling within you that even though I was not dreaming, I was not using my mind, I still had a sense of existence. Throughout that, 6, 7, 8 hours that I was sleeping, I was still existing. That's because the consciousness is still existing within the physical body, within the subtle body. That's called Sushupti. And then the next one, by the way, this Sushupti, that's important because that's the state of consciousness that the jivas have when they're merging in the body of Mahavishnu. Right? So like here Srila Prabhupada is saying in the purport that after the dissolution of the partial material body, the living entity remains unconscious only for a few months. Right? So when we give up our material body, we remain in a state of unconsciousness, sushupti, only for a few months until Mother Nature gives us a new body. Right? Just like when the baby is in the womb of the mother, when it's a tiny embryo, the consciousness is still there, but it's not active. The brain is not developed, the mind is not very alert yet. That's called sushupti. After some time, then the consciousness gets a bit more evolved. But initially, when the consciousness is put into the embryo, that phase is called sushupti. So similarly, just as the embryo is in that phase within the womb, similarly when we go into the womb of Mahavishnu, when we merge into his body, at the end, Srila Prabhupada is saying here, he remains unconscious for millions of years. So we also remain in this sushupti avastha, state of consciousness, for millions and millions of years. There's a fourth state of consciousness that the Upanishads explain. That's called turiya. Turiya avastha means when the consciousness is directed not to the subtle mind, it's not directed through the physical body out into the material world, but it's directed towards transcendence. This is called samadhi. When we're directing our thoughts simply to Krishna, Krishna's form, his name, his pastimes, tannam rupa charitadi sukirtananu smrityo kramena rasana manasi niyojya, that is called turiya. That is the state that we're after. And there's a nice story of a priest or a brahmana about how he's very, he's poor, but he's desirous of getting rich. So he goes out and he begs, and he comes back with a bowl of milk. Right? He goes out begging for the day, and he comes back to his house with a bowl of milk. And he thinks, before I go to sleep, I'll just put a bit of lemon juice in the milk, and by the time I wake up, it will be paneer. It will become paneer. So he puts some lemon juice in the milk, puts it on the stove, really low heat, or like that, and then he goes to sleep. And in his sleep, he starts to dream about the pot of milk on the stove with the lemon juice in it, which is supposed to be paneer. And in his dream, he dreams that the paneer has been formed, and then he wakes up and he takes this paneer, and then he goes to the market and he sells it, and he buys a hen. Right? And then he gradually starts a poultry farm, because what he does, he starts to sell the eggs, he buys more hens, and then he starts a poultry farm. And then from the poultry farm, one day he sells all the eggs and all the hens, and he buys a cow. And then he starts an entire dairy industry. He starts to sell milk products. And he starts to get rich and more rich. And then he sells these milk products, and he starts to buy diamonds and jewelry. And then he gives these diamonds and jewelry as gifts to the king. And then the king gives his most beautiful daughter to this priest. And he marries the daughter. And then they have a son, and he thinks, if my son is bad, I will correct him. So in his dream, he starts to correct his son by, hitting him, correcting him. So right next to him while he's sleeping, there's a piece of wood, there's a stick. So he actually, in his dream, he picks up that piece of wood and he starts hitting his son, only to be awoken by the shattering of the pot, which had the milk in it. So his whole dream, in reality, does not fructify, although in his mind it was fructified. So it shows us that whatever we're dreaming has an effect on our reality. Like Ganeshan was mentioning some classes ago, that if I conduct a physical action in this material world, the source of that, first of all, is in the mind. Right? So our external reality, the reality we experience in the physical world, is simply a manifestation of the reality we have inside our own mind. Right? Often I say that if we're peaceful and happy and content, then whatever even reverses come to us in the physical world, we'll take it in that same frame of reference, and vice versa. If we're always negative, then even we might, win the lottery, or people may glorify us, this and that, somehow we'll always find a reason to be depressed. That's why Krishna says, Uddara atmanatmanam anatmanam avasadayat. He says to Arjuna that use your mind to help elevate yourself. Don't degrade yourself with the mind. And Srila Prabhupada, he talks about this concept of the daydream and the night dream. He was having a conversation with one of his disciples, and the disciple asked him, when I'm sleeping at night, I dream. But Srila Prabhupada, you're saying that this physical world, that's also a dream as well. Srila Prabhupada says, yes, that's also a dream as well. And how does he explain that? He says that, you see, first of all, when we're dreaming at nighttime, we experience the same emotions that we experience when we're awake. When we're awake, we experience love, anger, hatred, satisfaction, enjoyment, fulfillment of desires. All these emotions we experience even when we're dreaming. When we're awake, we smell things, we touch things, we taste things. When we're sleeping, we also do exactly the same thing. We can also taste things when we're sleeping, we smell things when we see things when we're sleeping. So the question to be asked is, how do we tell the difference between a dream and reality? Because when we're having a dream, when we're experiencing a dream, it seems so real. But yet when we wake up, we call it a dream. So Srila Prabhupada is explaining that just as when you're sleeping at night and you wake up in the morning, right? Like here it's saying, just as one is engaged in his work after awakening from sleep. So when we awake and we start, doing things in the outside world, we say, oh, what I experienced in the last 6-7 hours, that was just a dream. Srila Prabhupada says, so because we forget, whatever subtle body we had in the dream, wherever we went, it's all temporary, it's gone. It no longer exists because now we're awake. So similarly, Srila Prabhupada says, what you do throughout the daytime, right? You may be working, talking to people, doing different things throughout the daytime. When you sleep, you forget that as well. So what applies to you in your dream, when you wake up, you say, my dream was just an illusion. When you go to sleep, what you did throughout your daytime, that also becomes an illusion as well. Because you don't remember anymore what you did throughout your daytime. Now you're in a dream world, you're experiencing something else. You have a different body, completely different body. You forget that you're, Indian, Australian, American, whatever. You forget that you're such and such years old. You forget that you have this responsibility to do. You forget your work. And now you're in a different reality. So, why do we say that nighttime is a dream and daytime is a reality? What we experience at nighttime is just a dream, and what we experience in the daytime is reality. Why do we say that? The answer, something my Guru Maharaj explains, and Srila Prabhupada explains as well in that conversation, but my Guru Maharaj is talking about this in his book, Hiding in Unnatural Happiness, and he says in there, in a certain section, he says that we attribute something as being a dream versus something being reality depending on one criteria, and that criteria is duration. If a certain existence has a smaller duration than another existence, we call that experiential existence with a smaller duration as being dreamlike or illusory. Does that make sense? Right? We sleep only for 5, 6, 7 hours. Right? And we're awake for 20 hours, 18 hours. Right? But because we're awake for a longer period of time than we are sleeping, that's why we call our sleeping the dream state, and we call our awakening state the reality. But just imagine that we slept for 20 hours and we were only awake for 4 hours. Then our awake state would be dreamlike and our sleeping state would become the reality. Right? Because we would be, that reality of dream would be a longer duration of time compared to how long we're awake for. So that criteria is duration. So, because we sleep for a small amount of time than we are awake, we call that a dream. But the point to be noted is that we may attribute our daytime activities as being reality, but ultimately, antavanta, tesham, what is it? Huh? No, anyway, it's the chapter 5 verse, how the yogis don't engage in enjoyment of the objects of senses because they know there's temporary. Yeah, yesham sparshaja bhoga dukkha yona yevate adyantamanta kaunteya nat tesham ramate buddha, nat tesham ramate buddha. Right? So they don't engage with the objects of the senses because they know it's temporary, and our material body itself is temporary. That means even if we're awake throughout our whole lifetime, still our body is temporary. That means compared to the reality of existence, right, the turiya state of consciousness that we're talking about, compared to the turiya state of consciousness, the jagrat state of consciousness that we experience when we're awake within the material body is insignificant. That means the actual reality, if you go by that criteria of duration, the actual reality is the reality that we have in the spiritual world. Or even if we're not in the spiritual world, the Krishna conscious reality of staying within, residing within the material body, but understanding that we're a spirit soul and we're part and parcel of Krishna. Okay, so we'll finish there. Thank you. Grantaraj Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.